Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're tackling a big question that's on a lot of people's minds right now, especially with all the recent budget talks in Washington. So what exactly is getting cut? And more importantly, is Social Security on the chopping block? What about SNAP and Medicaid? These are programs that millions of Americans rely on every single day, and the uncertainty around them is causing a lot of stress. So, what's really going on, and how might it affect you? Well, let's break it all down. And if you find this kind of content helpful, consider subscribing. That way, you'll stay informed and never miss important updates that could impact you and your family. So, let's start with what we know for sure. The latest budget proposal from House Republicans includes a plan to cut $2 trillion in mandatory spending. Now, if you're wondering what that means, it's basically spending that the government is required to fund every year, unless Congress changes the law. That includes Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Social Security alone makes up a huge chunk of federal spending, about $1.5 trillion per year, which is roughly 21% of the entire federal budget. So, anytime there's talk of reducing government spending, people naturally get nervous about whether Social Security is at risk. The official stance from lawmakers has been mixed. Some Republicans say they want to focus on cutting wasteful spending within Social Security, rather than reducing benefits. Others, including President Trump, have promised not to touch Social Security at all. But the reality is, with such a large portion of the budget going to these programs, it's hard to imagine a $2 trillion cut happening without some impact on Social Security, even if it's indirect. Now, let's talk about SNAP, which helps over 40 million Americans put food on the table. This program is facing some of the deepest proposed cuts. The House Agriculture Committee has been instructed to cut $230 billion over the next decade. That's a massive reduction, and based on early discussions, it seems like these cuts would come from stricter work requirements, limiting state waivers, and potentially reducing the amount of aid people receive. The problem with this is that food prices have gone up significantly over the last few years, making it even harder for families to afford groceries. Cutting food assistance at a time when inflation is still a big issue could push more people into food insecurity. Then there's Medicaid, which provides health care for low-income Americans, including children, seniors, and people with disabilities. The proposed budget includes an $880 billion reduction for the Energy and Commerce Committee, which oversees Medicaid. And while lawmakers haven't specified exactly how they'll implement these cuts, one of the most likely changes would be adding stricter work requirements for Medicaid recipients. This means that people who are unemployed or don't meet certain work criteria could lose access to their health care. And it's not just these programs facing cuts. The Education and Workforce Committee is expected to see a $330 billion reduction, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has been directed to cut at least $10 billion. Public education, infrastructure projects, and various workforce development programs could all be affected, though the exact details are still being debated. Also, while many programs are being cut, spending is increasing in other areas. The budget includes a $100 billion boost for defense spending over the next decade, and an additional $90 billion for the Department of Homeland Security to fund large-scale immigration enforcement initiatives. These increases reflect policy priorities focused on national security and border enforcement, even as social programs see reductions. Supporters of the budget cuts argue that reducing government spending is necessary to manage the national deficit and prevent excessive borrowing. They believe that some of these programs have inefficiencies and that reforms, like work requirements for Medicaid and SNAP, encourage economic participation and self-sufficiency. They also argue that prioritizing defense and border security is crucial for national stability, and that the tax cuts included in the budget will stimulate economic growth, ultimately benefiting all Americans. On the other side, opponents of the budget cuts warn that reducing funding for safety net programs could have significant negative effects on vulnerable populations, including seniors, low-income families, and people with disabilities. They argue that cuts to SNAP and Medicaid could increase poverty and worsen health outcomes, while reductions in education and infrastructure funding could harm long-term economic growth. Many worry that prioritizing tax cuts over social programs will widen the gap between wealthy and low-income Americans. So, what does all this mean for the average person? Well, if you're receiving Social Security benefits right now, there's no immediate change, but the long-term outlook is less clear. If you rely on SNAP, there's a strong possibility that eligibility requirements could get stricter or that benefits could be reduced. And if you're on Medicaid, new work requirements could make it harder to stay enrolled. If you're a student or part of a workforce training program, reductions in education and job-related funding could impact opportunities available to you. Now, the big question is, will these cuts actually happen? The budget plan is still just a proposal, which means it has to go through a long process before anything is finalized. There's already pushback from lawmakers on both sides, with some Republicans worried about cutting safety net programs ahead of the 2026 midterms. Democrats, of course, are strongly opposed to these reductions. And one thing to keep in mind is that no administration wants to be responsible for directly cutting Social Security benefits. It's just too politically risky. So, even if there are cuts to the Social Security Administration's budget, they're more likely to impact things like customer service, processing times, and administrative costs rather than the monthly benefits people receive. But again, without more details on where exactly the $2 trillion in cuts will come from, there's a lot of uncertainty. This is why staying informed is so important. Policy changes like this affect real people, and sometimes the discussions around them can be complicated and hard to follow. If you're worried about how this could affect you, make sure you're keeping up with what's happening. Call your representatives, ask questions, and make your voice heard. Also, let me know in the comments, are you concerned about these proposed budget cuts? Do you think Social Security, SNAP, or Medicaid should be off limits when it comes to spending reductions? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.